are broadcasting right now. Americans across the country are casting their final votes in this 2020 election, casting the last of what will likely be a record number of ballots. Vince Culinaise, Editorial Director at the Daily Caller, joins me now on Skype to talk more about this election cycle. Vince, so good to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I know you've been following this election very closely. What are you going to be looking for tonight once the polls close?
First and foremost, Florida, because Florida will be one of the first states that gets us results, and it's the one that's the most critical to the president holding on to it. If he does that, this election stretches on. If he loses Florida, it is all but impossible for him to win this election. So it's a big one tonight watching Florida. The other three states that we're watching really closely are Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. A lot of attention paid to Pennsylvania in these last few days. So much attention that the candidates themselves have gone out there. They've brought high-profile surrogates. We saw Joe Biden bring Lady Gaga, for instance, to Pennsylvania this past week. And we saw big endorsements. We saw the Pittsburgh Union Tribune, for the first time since the 1970s, endorse a Republican candidate for president. They endorsed Donald Trump because they believe he's better for the working man in Pennsylvania, in a very important state for energy production. So it is a tough one, and this will be, I think, a nail-biter tonight. We won't get Pennsylvania results quickly. We're not expected to get them until at least Friday. But the first results I'm looking for, definitely Florida.
Okay. All right, Vince. In this year's presidential election, voters have heard two very different messages from two very different men with different styles about how they're going to lead the country. How do you think, Vince, that's resonating with voters?
Well, it's interesting because it feels like most of this election has actually just been a referendum on one guy, Donald Trump. It really has come down to, I think, for a lot of people, whether they like him or they don't. And ultimately, that'll manifest itself in how people vote today. This year was obviously unusual in a whole bunch of ways. The pandemic was the big thing. And again, China mismanaged that horrifically at the outset, lied about its existence, worked with the World Health Organization to corrupt data about what was going on. And then, of course, it arrived all over the planet during that intervening time. And when it did, now many countries have had to deal with it. The United States has been hit very hard. That's led the Biden campaign to hole up. He's been mostly locked away in Delaware at his home for much of this campaign, not doing anything traditionally, not out there campaigning like a typical presidential candidate. Meanwhile, President Trump, he's been out there. So what I'm looking at is to what extent is this election really a referendum on only one guy, the guy who's been in office for the last 4 years? I can tell you right now, there is some exit polling coming out. People say the economy, number one issue that they care about in their voting. And also, many people do say, the majority, that they are better off now than they were 4 years ago, even amidst the pandemic. That's a good sign for the president of the United States. Let's see if it holds.
Yeah, speaking of the pandemic, and this leads me to my next question, Vince. It's been on top of mind for people all year long now and going through the election, even impacting voting itself. How much of an issue do you think that's going to be going forward?
We'll see. I mean, it really comes down to how much of this was just simply politics being played. Because a lot of this right now, the Biden campaign for much of the year took this posture that they needed to be way safer than anything Donald Trump was doing. So as a result, I think they scared a lot of the Democrat base, much more than the average Republican, I would say, is scared of this pandemic. It's obviously very serious, but there's clearly a partisan break between the way Republicans view how they engage in life and Democrats. It also could have a big impact on the election today and this week. Think about this. So many Democrats chose to mail in their ballots. So many Republicans, if the turnout is big today, and some signs indicate that it is, decided that they would vote in person today. The pandemic very well could dictate who the next president of the United States is on that factor alone.
Well, Vince, not a lot of time left, but I do want to talk about this. Another thing that was talked about during the election has been the battle for the suburbs. What's your sense of how successful President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden has been in reaching out to that group of voters?
Well, this has been a messy issue for sure. I think one of the ways that the President Trump has attempted to appeal to the suburbs is to point to the violence that we've seen take over, especially city streets, during the summer and throughout the year. A lot of riots this year that caused a lot of Americans consternation. In fact, the violence that we saw just last weekend in Philadelphia had Democrats very worried in the state that Donald Trump could win it because nobody wants to see violence in the streets. And the president was basically expressing the message, the suburbs need to be careful. This violence could spread there, and that's the last thing that any of us want. Will that message appeal to voters? Well, we'll wait to see today. But I think appealing to the suburbs is critical in order to become the next president of the United States.
All right, Vince, we're going to leave it right there. Vince Culinaise, Editorial Director at the Daily Caller. Thank you so much for your time, Vince.
Thank you.